The Samaritans originate from the northern kingdom, the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh. And so they share with the Jews the whole history of slavery in Egypt, the wilderness journey and deliverance, and the entry into the promised land. They had their own holy place, however, on Mount Gerizim, where indeed they had at one stage built a temple. And their argument, as you can pick up from this gospel, was that that was the place chosen by God rather than Jerusalem. Well, their temple is now, like the Jerusalem temple, also in ruins. But even today, I understand the Samaritans still keep the Passover there on Mount Gerizim, even though there are now fewer than 800 of them left. But be that as it may, like so many other groups which share close origins and are ostensibly very close, the Samaritans represented to the Jews an heretical sect which had got it all wrong and were therefore seen as dangerous and subversive. And in fact, as we can sense very clearly from the Gospels, in that respect, feelings were pretty mutual. Most Jews in our Lord's day would avoid passing through Samaria altogether if they possibly could. They would prefer to cross the River Jordan, continue on that side, and then cross back again, rather than actually pass through that area. As St. John tells us this morning, pulling no punches, the Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. But you do not have to be a biblical scholar to know that Jesus, remarkably, did not share that attitude. Did he not once tell a rather challenging story about a good Samaritan? The concept of a good Samaritan was really quite unthinkable in that place and time. And here, St. John tells us in the words of the King James Bible, the modern translations seem not to pick it up in quite the same way. Jesus must needs pass through Samaria. He must deliberately and intentionally go where these people live, who are loathed, despised, and even feared. And of course, as the story develops, we can see why. It is a very beautiful story, and there is not much time here this morning in which to consider it. Jesus is fatigued by his journey, presumably made on foot, and the heat is strong because it is the middle of the day as he arrives at Jacob's well. And the interesting, and I think perhaps important thing, is that both he and the woman share Jacob as an ancestor, respect and admire and venerate him as an ancestor. And so they meet, in a sense, on common ground, perhaps the only common ground there is, where otherwise everyone would have agreed that there was no common ground between them at all. And the Lord rests there in the shade of some trees which make the most of the moisture deep down in the soil around the well, whilst his disciples go shopping for some lunch in the nearby town. And when the woman arrives at the well, Jesus initiates a conversation. She is evidently startled that he, who is so obviously a Jew, should even acknowledge the presence of this Samaritan. Yet he asks of her a simple favor. She has her bucket with her. He has no means of plumbing the depths of Jacob's well. As the conversation moves forward, and of course we have to skip it to a large extent this morning, it becomes a less comfortable and a more obscure conversation so far as the woman is concerned. Who is this man who can offer living water, whatever that might be, and who appears to seem, or perhaps seems to think himself to be even greater than great Jacob himself, who first built the well and used it together with his family and herds? But that, of course, is the question which faces us each, and which in the end faces every man. Who is this man? It's a good question for us to ask ourselves. Who is he? Who do we think that he is? Well, she is moved by his evident sincerity and charisma, and can begin to see that he must be speaking metaphorically. But just as she begins to be rather fascinated, the earth, she must feel, begins to open up beneath her, because he asks about her husband. And then, to her utter astonishment, reveals that he knows altogether much more about her than is comfortable for her, which might incidentally remind us that he also knows rather more about you and me than is comfortable for us. And so she is even more alarmed and tries to deflect the conversation by picking up a familiar argument. Mount Gerizim, this mountain, is the place God chose for his worship, she says, not Jerusalem. You Jews have got it wrong. And that is how she will change the subject away from herself and get even with this Jew, whoever he is. But his response is profound. It does not dwell on a controversial past or even on a controversial present, but looks forward in a way that she can never have imagined and anticipates a new approach to worship altogether, one with which she can hardly argue. The woman, whose manner of life has hardly been exemplary, even by Samaritan standards, finds faith is kindled within her, and it draws out of her her profession of belief in the coming of the Messiah. There is some faith there, and the conversation draws it out. And so again, the Lord has brought them both onto, this time, a spiritual common ground. The return of the disciples gives her the opportunity to break off the conversation altogether and return to the town. And the few minutes, one imagines, that this takes is enough time for his words to sink in. I am he. And then the story moves to its quite glorious conclusion. Many Samaritans of that city believed in him because of the woman's testimony. He told me everything I have ever done. And then a really most improbable reconciliation takes place. And we ought to reflect how really improbable it was then, and perhaps relate it to some of the impossible situations, intractable situations that we know about. Those Samaritans asked Jesus to stay with them, and he stays there for 2 days. This is the power of the Lord to heal even the most ancient divisions and to bring reconciliation in even the most intractable situations. And John, who one may believe was a witness to it all, tells us many more believed because of his word. They said to the woman, "It is no longer because of what you said that we believe, for we have heard for ourselves, and we know that this is truly the Saviour of the world." It's a wonderful story. That's the climax of the story, and it's a wonderful story of at least a proportion of the inhabitants of this otherwise unknown Samaritan town coming joyfully to faith in Jesus, something which has not yet happened in Israel itself. And I ask you to go home and read this gospel again, slowly, thoughtfully, and prayerfully, because it has so much to teach us. How Jesus deliberately chose to go to that place, which would almost certainly be hostile, where the people were none too good, actually, where they were unloved, where they felt marginalized and resented. How he found and chose the common ground on which a real life-changing engagement could take place. And think how the woman herself, a kind of nobody really, became herself such a great and successful missionary, literally bringing her friends and acquaintances to Jesus. How she quite unconsciously made that link, which each of us needs to do, between those we know and love and the living Lord Jesus himself. And think of the great joy which the gospel brought to that otherwise unknown town or village as its inhabitants embraced the Lord into their midst. There are, it seems to me, just too many parallels with our own circumstances for us to just pass over this story as just another story about Jesus. So I urge you to reflect on it more deeply.